Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Fighter Series on Red Corner Boxing, sponsored by Easy Storage, coming to you live from Cincinnati, Ohio, in the United States of America. Today, episode 16 focuses on a standout fighter out of the United Kingdom named Nigel the Dark Destroyer Benn. Born out of East London, England in January of 1964, started his career as a part of the West Hampton Amateur Boxing Club, became the American Boxing Association middleweight champion in '86 as an amateur. He would quickly turn professional early, putting together a very nice record with 22 wins, all by knockout, for an all-British showdown with a one-time standout Michael Watson at Finsbury Park in London, in a fight basically where a jab by Watson floored Benn for the count, and Watson would go on to bigger and better fights. But it was the next fight after that, Nigel Benn ventured here to the United States to make his mark in the middleweight division. His next fight came against a standout named Jose Amparo, where he basically would go the 10-round distance to win a decision. But it was two fights after that where he started to really make his mark when he won the World Middleweight Championship after being floored early. He would floor the tough, durable standout Doug DeWitt in Atlantic City 4 times, 3 times in the 8th round, to capture the middleweight championship and put himself among the world middleweight champions. After a one-round slugfest with Iran Barkley to retain his championship, he would return home to Birmingham for an all-England showdown with the standout Chris Eubank Sr. in what was one of the hotly contested rivalries, not just in English boxing, but in all of boxing at the time. And what was a classic fight where both fighters had their moments, but it was Eubank who gradually wore down Benn, basically beat Benn up to where Benn's face started to swell, and he would be declared the winner in the 9th round on a technical knockout to win the first of that 2-fight series, where I'll touch on the second fight here in a second. But that being the last fight for Benn in the middleweight division, so now we're going to talk about him as he ventures up to the super middleweight division, is where he started to really make his mark. Up there, he had a couple fights, including a knockout win over Robbie Sims, best known as the half-brother of Marvelous Marvin Hagler. He would also have a one-punch KO win over a durable South African fighter named Talani Sugarboy Malinga, who was once known to give Roy Jones one of the tougher fights of Jones' young career. But Benn just got rid of him in 91 in less than 6 rounds to get a win, and a knockout also of another fighter named Dan Sherry, which put him in the another title shot at 168 against a fighter named Mauro Govano out of Italy, going to his backyard. Fight was stopped on cuts because Benn was starting to give Govano a beating, and the blood was starting to pour. Fight was stopped, and Benn is rewarded his second world championship at 168 pounds. After 2 title defenses against guys like Nicky Piper and Lou Gint, he would get the rematch, an all-Britain rematch that was highly anticipated, and the rivalries really start to spark between Benn and Chris Eubank Sr., the rematch in 1993, in a fight where it's going to be all Britain, a 2-belt unification at super middleweight. Turned out to be a classic for the English faithful over there at Wembley. Fight turned out to be a draw where it's still hotly disputed to this day as to who won the fight. It was basically the British version of what Leonard Hagler was in terms of disputed decisions. But it was that night where Benn and Eubank gave it their all in a classic fight in 1993, where the fight was basically ended in a draw. And after that, he would come back with 2 more wins against Henry Wharton and Juan Carlos Jimenez Ferreira in successful defenses of a super middleweight championship, which leads to the super fight in the almost unfortunate super fight of February 25, 1995, billed as Sudden Impact, the fight against Gerald McClellan. Everybody, especially in London, knows the story of this one, where basically Benn and McClellan were in a tough, physical, strong fight both ways that saw Benn floored early, coming back in the middle rounds, having been floored again in the 7th round. But of course, Benn knocking McClellan down and out in the 8th round, largely due to fatigue. And we know the unfortunate circumstances with Gerald McClellan after the fight. But Nigel Benn would retain a super middleweight championship in what was a war and a classic. The unfortunate circumstances with McClellan's health, we know the story on that one, especially in the fight game. But for Ben, he would collapse due to excessive exhaustion and dehydration after that one. But it turned out to be Nigel Benn's peak, as he would get the biggest win of his career over a standout Gerald McClellan. Of course, we know the unfortunate circumstances after the fight for McClellan, but still Ben's biggest win that put him on the map amongst some of the better fighters in the 160 and 168-pound divisions. But after that fight, he would face two more opponents, beating Vincenzo Nardiello and Danny Perez, and then got a rematch with Talani Sugarboy Malinga because it was an mandatory that had to be fulfilled. And that fight, Ben basically just showed that McClellan fight that he wasn't the same guy after the fight, because it may have gotten to him, losing a tough split decision to Malinga and losing a super middleweight championship. And later on over there, he would have two fights against the tough and durable Irish warrior named the Celtic Nightmare, Steve Collins, in fights where Collins, both fights, just wore down and used up Nigel Benn. The first fight was a TKO, and the second fight, Ben retired on the stool. Of course, it was the first fight that Ben sustained an ankle injury, so he pursued a rematch in an all-UK showdown between the Englishman Ben and the Irishman Collins, and the fight was basically stopped at the end of the sixth round. And after that fight, it was Ben who retired from boxing for good at that point. He contemplated the ideology to fight in September 2019 as a comeback at age 55 against the one-time title challenger Saki Obika, but that did not go through because he had an injury in training to his shoulder, and that basically ended his comeback attempt. So basically, that was the end of Nigel Benn, who was a standout super middleweight, a guy who could punch with either hand, very, very, very skilled, one of the better 160 and 168 pounders in the history of that division. Go on to do many things outside of the sport. Of course, you know the story with his son Conor Benn, who's a fighter himself. Him and Chris Eubank Jr., as we know, gave the country of England a terrific show, reliving the rivalry of the Benn Eubank Senior rivalry from way back when. In 2024, he would join a Four Kings documentary of English fighters with Benn, Eubank, Lennox Lewis, and Frank Bruno. And basically, after an attempted suicide attempt in 1999, he would turn his life around, devote his time to Christianity, and become committed to the faithful wife he married from that point forward. One of the terrific standout fighters in the middleweight and super middleweight divisions out of the UK at a time when that division got hot with fighters around there. We talk about Benn, Eubank Sr., and Steve Collins, among many others. Nigel Benn stood out. Just a terrific, terrific fighter. He wasn't called a Dr. Story for nothing. He knew how to beat you up, and he beat a lot of guys up in his day. Two-time world champion, just simply one of the best to come out of England. What a hell of a fighter, and what a hell of a career the great Nigel Benn was out of England. And that'll wrap up this edition of the Fighter Series on Red Corner Boxing. Hope everyone has themselves a wonderful rest of the day. Enjoy yourselves, take care, and God bless.